Hello, welcome to the Vanishing Inc warehouse. I'm here in Sacramento, and I'm really excited about this event that we have going on Facebook Live, on YouTube, and everywhere else. So please add some comments, say hi, and we can bring them onto the screen. Love to hear from you all. And the reason we're here is to celebrate the launch of a brand new trick by my best friend, by my co-founder, Joshua J. And we're going to talk about the trick. We're going to also show you the trailer for the first time. And we're going to talk about not just the usual aspects of the trick. Is it practical? Are the angles good? But we're going to talk about the theory and the thoughts and the detail that went into this trick. So I am excited to bring him in. Please welcome my best friend, Joshua J.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for hosting this, Andy. I appreciate you being here. You've seen this trick on its long journey to get to where we're at.
Yeah, I saw it right from the start, before it had any kind of presentation, and then I saw it right in Six Impossible Things, where you just absolutely tore down the room with this trick. So instead of talking about it, I think we should play the trailer right now. How do you feel about that?
Great, let's do it.
Why don't you introduce it?
This is a trick called Trojan Deck. I'm very excited to release it. We're going to be joined shortly by somebody who's very important to me and has improved all aspects of my magic, including this trick. And so it's going to be a chat on things far beyond just the trick itself, but on how narrative works or doesn't work in magic, which is something I think should be interesting to most of us. The trick that you're about to see, the trailer was cut from a performance we did in a studio for people who've never seen it before.
Sorry, I misspoke. We're not going to show the trailer. We're going to do something better. We have a clip from Six Impossible Things instead.
Oh, okay. So I can set this up a little differently. So my show, Six Impossible Things, which ran in New York for 18 months, took people in 6 different environments. So 20 people were taken from room to room to room. And in one of those rooms, they would go in, and I'm not there. I'm left in a different environment. And they go in and they sit in a circle in chairs. And then one person is designated, because they've been given a deck of cards in the previous room. They're designated to sit on the floor. And I come into the room and face them. And I drop, all the other lights go out. Music comes up, and they get to watch down in the middle of the circle. They get to watch this. We are going to tell a story with this blue deck of cards and your red deck of cards, Clara. Now, the only thing I'll tell you about this story before we begin is that it's completely true, and by the end, you will know that it's true. And the story goes like this. He believed in fate. She didn't. She wasn't even supposed to be in the restaurant that night, but something drew her there so they could meet. Now, I've got this blue deck of cards, and I would like you to take the blue deck, shuffle them up. When you're done shuffling them, give them some cuts, and I will do the same with this red deck of cards. Whoa. That is some serious shuffling going on here. Are you a poker addict, or?
You caught me.
Yeah, okay, good. So when you're done shuffling, just give them some cuts in your hands. That's good. Here's the story. In 1977, there was this man in Canton, Ohio, and he decided to go to his favorite restaurant. But when he got there on this particular night, he found, unusually, that it was packed. He had to circle around the parking lot 3 times before he could finally find a place to park. He goes inside once he's parked, and he gets in line. Meanwhile, across town, there's a woman, stranger to him, but she's decided to go out with friends that night, so she's called a taxi. But on this particular night, the taxi's running late. For any millennials in the crowd, taxis like Lyft, Via, Uber, something like that. But on this particular night, the taxi is running late. And the reason the taxi is running late is because he stopped for a coffee. But the taxi driver got the coffee and it was too hot to drink, so he puts it in the cup holder of his car. So our story has just 2 characters. A guy at the back of the line in the Dutch pantry, and a woman, a stranger, sitting in her parlor watching the seconds tick by, smoothing the wrinkles out of her white linen dress, waiting for her evening to start. Finally, the taxi arrives, she gets in, and off they go. Now, Claire, you've shuffled up that blue deck. I've shuffled up this deck of cards. I want you to spread through the deck like this, and I want you to get a feeling on a card. I have no idea what card that will be or how you'll get a feeling, but when you get a feeling, just set the card down without looking at it. Good. And of course, you don't know what that is, and you know what that card is, right? And we're going to look at these cards, but not now. We're going to look at these cards in exactly 2 minutes, when hopefully it means something. You don't have a pocket on your shirt, so I would like you to take that card and put it under your shoe. And I'll place mine in my pocket. Good. And now, please, keep shuffling.
Oh, okay.
All right. So here's the story. A woman's in the back of the taxi, and the taxi's speeding down the road when all of a sudden the light changes from yellow to red. The taxi driver slams on the brakes. Coffee goes everywhere, all over this woman's white linen dress. So she says, "Stop the car, I have to fix this." Taxi driver says, "Okay, fine." Stops the car, she gets out, and she wanders off into the night. Now everybody watch this. That's the last time I change the order of these cards. I am not going to touch them again. And now I would like you to do the same thing. Place the cards there and give them one cut and let everybody watch you do it. And complete it. Claire, do you want to cut them one more time?
No.
No.
Stick with it.
All right, good. Let's start with these cards. There's some people sitting far away. Can you verify that these cards are not in numerical order or in new deck order or separated by color? They are really mixed up.
Yeah.
Would you square them up and put them face down in front of you? And let's check and see how you did. I want to give people a chance to see here. Yeah, that looks good to me. Look good to you? Good. So, here's how the story ends. This woman's walking down the street. She comes upon the first place that's open, the Dutch pantry. She goes inside, she opens these two double doors, and she runs into him. And he laughs at her because she's covered in coffee, but then they talk for 5 minutes. And 5 minutes turns into an hour, turns into 2 hours, turns into a date the next night. And these two people ended up spending their whole lives together. And when that man would tell me the story, he would always explain that he believed in fate. But she didn't. She wasn't even supposed to be in the restaurant that night, but something drew her there so they could meet. Claire, would you turn over that card?
Oh my God.
Now the thing is, whenever I see this, and I don't mean this as in a card trick, I mean a coincidence of any kind of weird coincidence, the first thing I think is like, what happens if one thing had happened differently, right? I mean, you watched me cut the cards. What if I cut one card more or one card less? You watched Claire cut. What if she cut one more or shuffled into a different order? Well, then the trick doesn't work. And that makes you wonder, what happens if the coffee wasn't too hot, or the light didn't change at that exact second, or the parking lot wasn't crowded? Well, I can tell you for certain, it means these two strangers would never have met, never fallen in love, never gotten married, never had a kid. And when that kid was 6 years old, his dad would have never shown him his first card trick, and then I wouldn't be on this floor telling you this story. I swear to God, this is the true story of how my parents met. This was my bedtime story till I was like 14. But it is a true story, and all these seemingly inconsequential events had to happen in exactly a certain order for me to even be alive, let alone into magic. Now, Claire, I promised I would not touch those cards, so would you pick up that deck? And would you deal that 5 of diamonds right there? Yeah. And would you take the next card, whatever it is, and would you deal that card up? Are you ready to deal with me?
Yeah.
Deal as fast as you can. Every card in this deck, every single card in this deck, and I do mean every single card. Look, every single card. That's the Queen of Hearts. That's the 7 of Hearts. That's the 3 of Diamonds, 8 of Spades, Ace of Hearts, Queen of Diamonds, 5 of Spades, Ace 3, 9, 6, 2, all the way down to King of Spades, 9 of Hearts, 2 of Spades, 3 of Clubs, 6 of Hearts. Every single card in that deck, a perfect.
Wow.
Yeah, well done. But I know what you're thinking. You're all thinking, yeah, but that's all probably just luck. I'll tell you something that's not luck. At the very beginning, when you were shuffling up the cards, I asked you to stop on a card that felt different, like it felt like it could be important. And I did the same. Take that card out now. You see, this part isn't luck. This part isn't chance. I'd like to believe that this part is fate.
What a great trick. I still remember the first time I saw it in that show with the full production values, and it's really a goosebump moment.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, not to get off topic so quickly, but it is amazing to me the difference and the factor that theatrics play in all of this. Like, I do that trick every night in these shows that I'm doing on this tour, and even at the end of my lectures. And when you don't have the music and you don't have the lighting, it's still fun. It's still great, but it isn't affecting the way it is when you get every little controllable element controlled. And I miss that. I mean, that's just not realistic to get on the road, in a venue that you don't choose. But when you can get it, my God, sky's the limit for what's possible in all sorts of ways.
Well, I have so many questions for you. The first and most important one is, what is a Dutch pantry? I've never heard these words.
Oh, so this is the Amish restaurant that's really famous. So it's Amish owned and operated, and so that's the Dutch connection. And a pantry would be the place that they stored it. So yeah, anybody from northeastern Ohio, if you say the Dutch pantry, they'll be like, that place, still there.
Turns out I'm not from there, so that makes sense. I want to talk just for a couple of minutes about the trick, and then we'll bring in our special guest as well. And then we can talk more about storytelling magic, because I think that's how we can make the most out of our time together. But let's specifically talk about Trojan Deck right now. How does a trick like this start for you? Are you starting with the concept of an effect? Are you starting with the story? How does it all work?
Yeah, I mean, I think a ton about the creative process, and it's what I think about probably the most. But obviously, you can't codify it entirely, and I'm excited to chat with our guest about this too, because I know he has a lot of interesting things on this topic. But what I can tell you is, I try to think about everything in magic. What it means is that I am trying to think about teasing out stories, and at the same time I'm cataloging great plots in my head. And so at one point, the true story of how my parents met, which isn't exactly this but is very, very close to this story that I tell, I realized that that's all about things falling into place perfectly, and that there's this trick that's all about a trick falling into place perfectly, and it seemed like the two go together pretty nicely.
But did the trick come before the story? Did they come in parallel?
Yeah, they come about the same time. I can't speak for anybody else, but I would say that I don't think a lot of great magic comes from thinking of a story or recalling a story and then retrofitting it to a trick. I think they kind of either have to come at the same time or start with the trick and find something to go with it. Because, at the end of the day, I'm a believer that the magic has to lead. The magic has to be super strong without the story. And then you have to be able to say, somehow this story enhances the trick rather than just detracts from it.
And I seem to remember you've removed phases from this trick. I remember, first of all, when you first started with it, you had a card with a silk on it. Am I remembering this right? And you've ended up, I think, stripping it back to make a really pure effect. What's your process for that?
Yeah, well, so I mean, it's still there in a sense, because we put a card in our pocket, each one. But Trojan Deck, if you try it without that something at the end, you'll find that it's a little bit, that there's some element missing. And I think what it is a human element. So when all the cards match, it's very much a table trick. It's very much about the trick. Bringing that card back, and I used to do it with a handkerchief and a thing, and I've done all sorts of things, big prediction. It's all about refocusing the moment on people and making it about people. So yes, 51 cards match, but we end with the idea that all those 51 cards match by chance, but you took out a card in the beginning and I took out a card in the beginning, and that's about us. And I think that that's what that ending is about. I don't really know. I just know that it's much stronger with it than without it.
Yeah, I've seen some people in the chat. The chat is going crazy, by the way, and it's great that so many people are joining us across all these different platforms. And we'll be bringing our special guest in soon, and we'll even be showing you the Trojan Deck itself shortly. But I've seen some people in the chat refer to that ending as a kicker ending, and in my mind, it's not a kicker ending at all. It's the stamp at the end of the trick. It's not like something that you shoehorned in. This ending is kind of required to really make this full circle, I think.
Yeah, and that's I think it's interesting. I mean, we could unpack it further, but it is one of those things that I feel, and there's so much of this in Magic, that we can sit on the things that we've read and the things that we've been told and the things that we know theatrically to be true for hours. And you can sit in the laboratory and talk about why theatrically it's never stronger to end on a slower note or this or that. But unfortunately, until you get in front of real people and you try it both ways and you believe in both ways, so you're really trying to make it work in every case, that you can speak with authority. And I mean, I've done that, and I can tell you that without that human element, without bringing it off the table, without bringing the spectator back in to help you tell that last part of the story, it just doesn't quite work as well.
I can imagine. That's so true. You call it the Trojan deck, but actually this is not just one trick, right? The Trojan deck is kind of the gimmick to make the trick work. So that suggests to me there are other tricks that use this gimmick.
Yes. You know, look, we're most concerned at Vanishing Inc. with just delivering something great to you and having you love it and be able to use it. But unfortunately, there's a marketing choice we had to make, and we didn't choose to basically market this as a gimmick with tons of possibilities, but that's really what it is. I mean, I don't want to say too much, but essentially the best part of all of this is and I don't want to say too much, but I want to say enough to help you understand. It's a card box that allows you to add cards in at any time in full view with nothing to do with your wardrobe or a servant or anything to do with anything else. You take the cards out of the box and set the box down, and you are now set up to add as many as half a deck into your deck anytime you want. And so not only do I use this for the trick that you just saw, but I close my big parlor show with this where I have 10 cards selected and lost in the deck by the spectators. And then I find all the cards in 1 minute in a world record setting routine at the end of my show. And all of that is predicated on taking that shuffled deck back, placing it on the box for a minute while I explain what's about to be done. And I pick up the cards, and now I'm boom, 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 boom into it. It's great for gambling stuff. You can have a deck thoroughly shuffled by people sitting around a table. Set the deck down as you explain. We're going to play 5-card stud. Here's what will happen. You can draw or turn in as many cards as you want. We'll take the shuffle deck that you cut and shuffled, and you deal them out, and now you have the whole deck stacked. So there's many, many things that you can do with this.
Before we do a little unboxing, have you ever done an unboxing before?
Never done an unboxing. I know it's what the kids like, so I'm going to pretend I'm 25 and do it.
I know you love TikTok, so I thought maybe you...
Yeah. I do love TikTok. Guys, I've just really got into TikTok lately, and I think that it would actually be beneficial to Andy's life if he did it for a few minutes at the end of every day, because it would help him see what the kids are doing, you know, relax a little. I think he needs to laugh more. If you agree, put it in the chat.
There was about this time last year, you went through a phase of doing the TikTok dances. Which is brilliant. But anyway, I want to ask you a question. I guess it's more of a comment, but you can talk about it more. I was there when we filmed the trailer for this, and you said a line, and I stopped you. You said, and it's really easy to do. And I was like, stop. This trick is not easy to do. And then when you reminded me of what the method is, I was like, it's so easy to do.
Yeah. And I think that's... I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, tell a story for 5 minutes and make that interesting and compelling. What I can tell you is the trick itself has 0 moves. 0 moves. Like, it's easy to do technically, because if you can set a deck of cards on a box, you can do this trick. But as we know, presentationally, easy and difficult, that's something altogether different.
The chat is already talking about me starting up a TikTok account, so maybe it'll happen one day. So let's do this unboxing. Do it in your favorite TikTok style.
Here we go. So this is what it looks like. This is Trojan Deck, and you get, when you first open it, you will get this, and I'm going to be very vague about this. This is the box. This is the box. You assemble it. It takes about a minute and a half. You just pull off a sticky tab and put it together. But this is a very special thing that looks like a card box, and in my opinion, the best part about this whole package. So that's in here. You get 3 decks of cards. The first one is a normal pack. This is what you'll shuffle, and you'll use on your end. This is what they will shuffle. And this is what I have dubbed the single decker deck. If you followed my work in Out of Sight, you know that this is a deck of cards. It's a normal pack, but the cards have the same finish as a double decker deck, which is 1/4 of the method, is that plastic smooth finish. And the last part of the secret sauce, without saying too much, is this. This is a double decker deck of cards. That's 52 cards in there, but they're the extra thin cards. And the reason that we give them to you as a full deck is because we want you to be able to do this with the stack you want. So as much as I use this as a closer, if you use this with a memorized deck, when you're done, you have a memorized deck ready to use for the next trick that you want to do. So you can use a shuffle deck and just put the cards in the order that you shuffle it to. You can use a memorized deck. You can use a setup deck. You can use a deck that is in a certain order after some tricks you've performed. There are many ways to skin the cat.
So it's going to be launched later today. People can check it out on Vanishing Inc. It will be live very, very soon. So please come and visit, take a look. But now I want to move on to the next stage of this, introducing our special guest. And he's somebody who has worked on this trick with you over the years. He's been incredibly helpful and influential. So why don't you introduce him? Introduce him, Josh. Do it.
This is a wildly talented person who I'm delighted to know and work with creatively on lots of different things. He is just a head above the pack in so many aspects of magic, but the one that we'll focus on today is presentationally. When he talks, I just listen, and I am so compelled because he understands what makes for great magic. So without further ado, let's unveil our secret guest. It is Luke Germain.
Well, hello. That was very kind of you, Josh. And Andy, I'm happy to see that you are proudly displaying your Pokemon card collection.
I have quite the collection back here. Thousands of
Black Friday is keeping you busy there in the warehouse.
Yep, having fun.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of comments just to kick things off straight away. And the first thing is that this is just a spectacularly good trick. It really is a spectacularly good trick. And one of the interesting things that happens, and just bringing it into the lens of magic and narrative, one of the interesting things that happens is that when an effect is distilled down to its purest form, that's when the trick becomes great. Now, I'm not going to pick other examples of this premise, but the idea of 2 decks of cards being shuffled and then those cards being in the same order through some incredible coincidence is certainly a premise that we've seen explored using other methods over the years. Here's why I will boldly state that Josh's version of this trick is better than anything that's come before, is because it takes away all of what damages magic. And what do I mean by that? Well, magic is damaged because it is inherently operating on what I call anti-drama. Anti-drama is all of the moments in the magic trick where you have to ask somebody to do something, because if they don't do it, the trick won't work or the trick won't be perceived by the audience. So for example, here, take these cards, shuffle them. Now take those cards and deal them into 2 piles. Now pick up one of the piles, go through that pile, take out all of the black cards. Now take out all of the clubs and hand them to me. There might be a reason that you need to do that from a method perspective, but from purely the perspective of drama, this is the opposite of drama. This is just not doing anything. But that means that you're in a really difficult position as a magician, because you have to play the balance between the narrative and the method. So what Josh does in Trojan Deck is take away all of the anti-drama. So now the effect is completely precise. The deck is shuffled by spectator, is put on the table. There is none of the anti-drama that's normally necessary in order to bring about this kind of blockbuster conclusion of the effect. So this brings with it a challenge, which is 99.9% of the things that magicians say when they perform is not script that's driving anything forward. It's simply narrating the anti-drama. I won't mention this performer. He's a friend of all of ours here. But there's on a TV series that he once said these words in this order, and I've memorized it as an example to myself. He said, here I have a deck of cards. I'm going to shuffle the deck of cards. He shuffles the deck, and then he says, so now I have shuffled the deck. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to take a card from the deck. Please take a card from the deck. So I shuffled the cards, and then I asked you to take a card from the deck. You have now taken a card from the deck. Please take that card and place it back into the deck. I will now shuffle the cards. He shuffles the cards. I asked you to take a card from the deck, and then I shuffled the cards back in the deck. Let's recap. And then he repeats the entire thing again.
Yeah.
Right? So this is the clearest example to me of anti-drama. And if you go back and watch the performance from 6 Impossible Things that we saw at the beginning, that example I just gave you, I think will clarify what I mean by the fact that none of that anti-drama is in the Trojan Deck effect. So that's one of the gifts of this trick, is that its method is just really good, right? So you get rid of all of the anti-drama. But now here's the challenge. So when someone like Josh creates a trick that has no anti-drama, what he's now done is solved the first problem, which is, how do I create a great magic trick? But unfortunately, he's created for himself an even bigger problem, which is, now I've got a great trick and I've got nothing to say. Because 90% of what's said in magic is narrating action. It's not about driving story forward. So the first observation is that this trick is a brilliant example of how a really good method, really smart composition will remove all of the anti-drama, which now leaves you this blank canvas, which needs to be driven forward by narrative, by script, by the idea of what is dramatic. And Josh gives you that in the story that he tells, but maybe you don't want to tell the story that Josh tells.
Hopefully not.
I mean, hopefully not, right? But what you're given with the Trojan Deck is a blank canvas, because the method itself is basically inviting you to find your own story, because you don't have to justify any of the boring anti-drama that normally you have to justify. So there's a real gift when you find a magic trick that's like composed that expertly, because it allows you to start telling stories in a much more direct way. And I think it lets you, it's a really good model that you can then apply to other material as well, because it hasn't got any of that peculiar anti-drama. And the final sort of observation, and then I'll stop this weird monologue, is that the moment at the end of the trick where the cards are in one in Josh's hand and one in the spectator's hand, I think there's a couple of things that are interesting about that. I agree with what Andy said, which is it's not a kicker finish. I agree with what Josh said, which is it makes it more human as well. But one of the other things that I think is kind of interesting about it is it's the perfect finish for this trick, because it's an inevitable surprise. Now, this is a really easy way to think about it, which is at the end, when those cards are face down, everybody in that room already knows that they match. No one's thinking like, oh, I wonder if that's the same card. It's not a surprise. So when we talk about kicker endings, often a kicker ending is like, you know, a jack in the box, like something, a peanut can, right? Like we didn't expect it and it surprises us. But here it's an inevitable surprise. We knew it was there. We knew it was in the pocket. We kind of forgot about it because of all of what's happening. And then in that moment, we've got a little bit of suspense, even though we know. In our heads, we're thinking, no, it can't be, but it must be. It can't be, but it must be. It is. And I think in this particular effect, that moment is just a kind of bow on the top. And it's peculiar that one moment, if you took it out, I think as Josh mentioned, if you took it out, it would really change the feeling of the effects. It's peculiar that you can match 51 cards, and yet actually the moment that really, you know, sends it home is that one at the end. But I think it's vital that it's there. But I like to think of it as an inevitable surprise. So as I was listening to you guys talk.
No, that's so helpful, and I mean, I love so many of the terms that you've given us: the inevitable surprise and anti-drama. I mean, you've given a word, a capstone for things I think about a lot. The only thing that I wanted to add that I thought about while you were saying these things that hasn't been mentioned so far is the importance of texture. So I don't think any of the three of us would advocate here that we should always try and pair a trick with a story. I think that would get old really by the second one that you do. I don't think you can sustain that, and I don't think that that's good for Magic. But what I love about this is I don't do anything else in my repertoire like this. So when I do it, there's a change. There's a change in mood. If possible, there's a change in lighting and music. There's a whole change to approach where up to this moment, I am performing here now for you with things that you bring to the performance. But all of a sudden, I actually say, when I say, okay, come up here, Jane, and Jane, you're going to help us tell a story before we say goodbye tonight. And so now there's something different going on. And I think that texture is just really helpful and interesting in making your magic show varied. In other words, in adding different beats and hitting different notes. You know, Trojan Deck happened fourth out of about 8 pieces in 6 Impossible Things. I know, crazy, right? 6 Impossible Things, but there are like 8 or 9 actual pieces. But what I think worked about it was it didn't feel like the things before or after it. So I just wanted to say that because there's not a lot of things out there that touch the notes that this one touches.
I think one of the other things that you have to start thinking about when you're thinking about the idea of story and magic is there's actually there are multiple stories at work within the performance of any magic show. The top layer story is the story of this magician, right? Like Jay Sankey once said this great thing that sort of stuck in my head where he said, the job of the magician is to become a fantastic act of walking fiction. I always liked that phrase. But there are more than 2 stories happening. The top layer story is the narrative of this magician's character, this magician's magic power, this magician's worldview, all of the things that are wrapped up inside of the magician Andi Gladwin or the magician Joshua J. But then within that top level story, you have stories that fall in along the way. They're kind of stories within stories, because we've already attached to the narrative of the magician, and now the magician is telling us an overt or an explicit story. When you do tricks that are in the style of the Trojan Deck, it's almost like sitting down and saying, once upon a time, there were 3 little bears.
Yes.
Right? And the room realizes, okay, we're now engaging with an overt or explicit story that will be told. But above that, there is another story that's kind of invisible, which is the story of this magician who happens to be openly and explicitly, telling us the story of the 3 little bears. So that I think is where you start thinking about balance, right? And how you want those things to work, because an entire show of just one feeling is probably going to be quite difficult for an audience to bear, But certainly the idea of texture, I think, is present there. And the way that you tell the story is sort of present there. But there's also one other thing that comes to mind when we think about that, right? So you've got the top layer story, which is the idea of who this magician is. Then you've got these other stories that sort of populate this magician's expression, his artistic expression. And again, within sort of all of that, there is the unique challenge of being a magician that uses stories. And this is a bold statement, but I stand by it. And I've said it to people that write movies and all the rest of it. I think it's much harder to write a magic show than it is to write a movie or a TV series. And the reason I think it's much harder to write a magic show than write, Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones is because magicians have restrictions on them that no other art form has. and the community itself hasn't yet necessarily formed vocabulary for the challenges of overcoming the restrictions that are unique to Magic. So when you start forming Magic based in narrative, you look outside of the community for reference points, and suddenly you're reading Poetics by Aristotle, or or the 7 basic plots, or the Anatomy of a Story. You're reading books that are designed not to write magic tricks, but books that are designed because people want to write screenplays. And all of a sudden, the two worlds are just so confusing, right? Because doing a magic story is not doing a screenplay. And I think what happens when that moment kicks in a magic show, the moment of once upon a time, right? When the lights go down and Josh sits on the floor, he says, "I'm going to tell you a story." What happens there is the audience is understanding that what they're actually seeing is a magical metaphor that is playing out through the narrative. So it's not a story, because it has the unique moment of magic on the inside, right? Like a storyteller could sit down and say, once upon a time there were 3 bears, and he could tell the story from start to finish. He wouldn't need 3 bears on the stage with him, right? He could just tell the story.
Right, but magicians do.
A magician needs to produce their magic within the story itself.
Yes.
So at that point, it stops being an experience of story time, right? It's not a bedtime story anymore. It's becoming essentially a living metaphor that the story is assisting. And one final thing that comes to mind, again, from what Josh was talking about, when Andy asked Josh about which came first, the trick or the story, I think every magic trick has at its core its own story to be told. Now, if you're working against the internal logic of the effect you're presenting, it's going to be very hard to make that story compelling and interesting. Imagine trying to tell a story with the Trojan Deck effect that you just saw, that rather than being about coincidence and these things all aligning, imagine you were trying to tell the story of an army general, winning a war. I mean, maybe you could say, like the general strategized perfectly, so at the end of the war, everything, you could do it, but it would feel hard. It would feel stretched, right? Because internally, what's happening in this trick is about coincidence. So if those two things aren't aligned, like the trick itself tells a story. A tournament restore card is its own story. So if I do a tournament restore card, if I'm not talking about some notion of rebirth or of restoration, or of fixing that which is broken, then the two things are going to be working against each other in a way that's going to make life very hard.
And a technique I use for that is I always boil the trick down into what is the core idea of this trick, and you can go so far back. Like I have a trick where I have 6 spectators on stage, and I ultimately realized after struggling for a presentation, this trick is all about controlling one of those 6 people. So now the whole presentation is about control. So I find that really useful, and I bet while people are looking for their own presentation for the Trojan Deck, I bet that'll be a really useful thing for people to work out, what does this trick mean to me, what am I saying, and then build up from there.
And also to be like ultra aware of the fact that the effect and premise are 2 separate things, right? Like we tend to think of them as one thing, but a premise and an effect are actually independent of each other, right? The effect here let's use the Trojan Deck performance example, the effect is an impossible coincidence. That's the effect of what's happening. The premise of this effect is the story that makes the impossible coincidence a love story. So actually, this trick is a love story. Its premise its effect is impossible coincidence. Its premise, the story theme, is a love story. And that's why at the end, when those 2 cards are turned over, with one boy and one girl, there is a feeling of it being complete. Because it's about humans, because this card trick is a love story, right? That's what it means. So the 2 separate things, and it's very difficult sometimes to not fall into the trap of thinking effect and premise are the same. But the effect is what happens, what makes this impossible. The premise is the theme, the flavor, the idea that you communicate in the story that's in support of the effect itself. So those things together, now you've got a good recipe, right? Not too much salt, not too much pepper. It's just about right.
Fantastic. And let me just add, because I had a really helpful, encouraging revelation when I was thinking about presentations generally. Because I can imagine that some people see the performance of this trick and go, oh man, I don't know if I'm ready to pull off a 5-minute story. I don't know if I'm ready to create something around this trick where I can tell a story. But let me be encouraging for those watching. I looked back at some of my very favorite story, what I call narrative presentations. And these would include Eugene Berger's Gypsy Thread, where he talks about the cosmos. And they would include Tommy Wonder's routine for the robbed premise, the ring, watch, and wallet, where he talks about he's robbed, they took his ring, they took his watch. A particular trick from Johnny Thompson, a particular trick from Wayne Houchin, just great tricks that we would categorize as story tricks. And what I realized is, for the most part, they're less than 5 sentences. Now, that's pretty shocking, because when you think, oh, how would you tell a story with magic? I'm going to have to learn all about drama and storytelling and rising action and resolution and conflict and establishing characters. And you can. I mean, Trojan Deck's pretty involved in terms of its story. But my trick based on Alfred Hitchcock's work, Hitchcock, people talk to me all the time, oh, I love the trick that has Hitchcock. That's 3 sentences long. There's exactly 3 sentences about premise there, and the rest is the trick itself. So I think what's really encouraging is, like, it's very achievable for all of us to find 3 or 5 sentences. And when we think back about Eugene Berger's Gypsy Thread routine, I mean, that is so affecting and so powerful, and it's about a paragraph of exposition. So it's very achievable.
Well, again, this is one of those moments where you realize that the challenge of the magician using story is different from the challenges that gave birth to the resources our other storytellers use, right?
Yes.
So it's really easy to fall into the trap of thinking that you're not writing a script, you're creating literature. But you're not. You're creating a script, right?
Right.
All of the sources you might look to learn the techniques of storytelling, they're aiming to assist you in writing the next great novel, right? Or the next great screenplay or the next great movie. So that's a really interesting point. One of the things that I suggest to people is that you decide to love language, right? If you make the decision that one of the things that you are going to love is going to be language, you will become a better magician. Becoming sensitive to the way language works, becoming sensitive to what makes good writing great, that's going to help you. And you think about, like, one of my favorite opening lines of anybody in the world is the Slaughterhouse-Five opening, where it says, all of this happened more or less. So, like, it's just perfectly succinct, right? All of this happened more or less. Now, another writer, like, you look at Charles Dickens, right? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of enlightenment, it was the age of disillusionment, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. That's a phenomenal opening to a book, but it's like 4 paragraphs long. So looking at those two things,
yes,
they're both amazing pieces of writing. But the Slaughterhouse-Five example might be more aligned with the way a magician needs to think about writing and crafting script than, say, a Charles Dickens example, right? Like, so developing that sensitivity to language and learning how to be precise with language is going to help you, because, you can't tell stories as a magician in the same way that, you can if you're writing Game of Thrones, right? It's a different challenge.
It is. No, I think that's extremely inspiring, and I agree with you. And it's not just a love of language, it's a love of stories. Like, yeah. I'm just constantly looking to find the narrative, right? It's really fun to look for the narrative. You go on a vacation and you have many amazing things happen to you. You picked up this cool object here. You did this hike and it took a wrong turn. But you have to be able to step back from that, all these elements, and what do you take out? What do you leave in to create a narrative? If you were to share what you did out west in Yosemite National Park, if you were to share that, what has to be shared to give you a complete narrative? And that's the sort of exercise I'm always thinking about when I'm constructing a presentation, is what needs to be there and what is distracting and needs to come out.
And if I can observe something about you, Josh, is that you've become great over the last, 10 years in telling those stories in all aspects of your life. Like, wherever we are, even just in a coffee shop, or somebody asks you something, you can tell even a short story, but you've just got great at just improvising these stories. And Luke, you are of course fantastic at this. I guess you're using that as a practice to help learn to build these storytelling techniques, and it's so inspiring to see.
I think one of the things that you can do as a magician is realize that your job is to be interesting. So if you're not interesting when you're not doing a magic trick, it's highly unlikely you're going to be any more interesting when you are.
It's like that amazing Tamariz quote: "The job of a magician is to be a fascinator." Like,
yeah,
what a cool thing.
So, but you know, the truth is that the really interesting people are often made less interesting when they're performing magic. Right?
So true. That is so true.
If you're not already able to be interesting when you don't have the cards in your hands, it's probably going to be harder for you to be interesting when they are in your hands, because you've got all this other stuff to deal with, right? Like you've got to keep the break, you've got to palm the cards, you've got to, pinky count to 7 or whatever it is. That's all competing for your mental energy, focus, attention, spontaneous creativity. So yeah, I think that's all part of it, is like just understanding how to communicate, and that all comes into this love of language, though, right? Really good magicians are always really good communicators.
So I feel bad to be the guy who's starting to wrap this up, because this is an absolute masterclass in storytelling. You guys have shared so much so generously. But Luke, something I hear you say a lot, kind of a catchphrase almost, is that the best story wins. And I think we're in a position right now where many people watching this are going to be looking for their best story for the Trojan Deck, because I promise you, your best story is not how Josh's parents met when we do this trick. It would be kind of weird. However, that does leave everybody with a situation where we need to be finding our own story when we perform Trojan Deck. So I'd love to hear from both of you how we should go about finding our own best story.
Do you want to start, Josh?
Sure. That's a really great question. I mean, I am always very hesitant to codify any part of the creative process, because I know that for me it's messy and it's a confluence of things, and each trick is created in a way that's different than the next one. So I'm hesitant to say, here's exactly what you do. You go into your journal and you find this, and then you take a trick. So all I would say is that I think that the trick itself, Trojan Deck, which is 2 shuffled decks matching, has given you one of the most fertile blank slates that you can have. In other words, any part of life can be reduced down to crazy, or a chain of events that happens, and it has to happen in exactly that way for things to be as they are. I mean, that is such a fertile mind that all of us have examples of. And I can tell you this, maybe this is helpful for you as a final thought. A huge inspiration for this presentation was a scene in the movie with Brad Pitt and Cate Blanchett, Benjamin Button. There's just sort of innocuous scene in the middle where she narrates this moment in which she's answering a phone and leaving her studio, and he's walking down the road, and a car is coming from a total stranger, and he's late because of this, and boom, it ends with her getting hit by this car, and they meet. And that scene had nothing to do with the way my parents met, which was this bedtime story. But that scene was told in a way that I was watching it, and I literally leaned in because I was so fascinated by the storytelling quality. And that's how it happened. So in a very long and winding way, what I would say to you is be open to stories. Be open to the storytelling things that you're going to see and that come at you. And I'm sure something will present itself.
So I'll give a couple of sort of ideas. I sort of agree with Josh in the fact that the challenge of being creative is messy. And I think that if you try to formulate, you turn it into an equation or a machine, I think you're essentially creating a sausage machine, right? You're just putting a bunch of unpleasant things together and hoping that eventually nobody notices how unpleasant they all are in isolation, because they're also unpleasant as one thing. So the idea that you can, distill magic down to being like, take one from column A and one from column B and one from column C, that isn't my approach at all. I actually find it really vulgar. I think it's the opposite of art, right? But that being said, I also do and have over the years sort of created a bunch of techniques in my own thinking that help me make progress when I'm not inspired. Because the idea of being creative is that you're sitting around, like the idea of the writer, right? The Ernest Hemingway writer is that he sat there in his safari jacket with his cigar, and he's got his typewriter and his black coffee, and he's brooding, and he's waiting for the lightning to strike, and he's, but that's just a romanticized notion of what being creative is, because being creative means being creative to deadlines. So if you're working in the creative industry, occasionally you have to make progress even if you're not feeling inspired. So while I don't think that you can turn it into an equation, I do have little tricks that help me make some progress when that lightning hasn't struck yet. So one of them is think about the path of least resistance. Now, what do I mean when I say this? I think there is another common misconception about the creative life, which is that you should suffer in order to be creative. All of the romantic notions that we see of an artist involves the idea of suffering, right? They sit around toiling. Well, in my opinion, creativity is intuition at play, right? Your intuition is the source of your creativity. It will guide you in the direction that is the truest and most authentic expression of your story. You already know what your story is. Your challenge is, much like the Michelangelo quote, to be able to chip away all of what isn't needed to reveal what was always there in the first place. So if you're sat around and you're fighting with this creative feeling, right, and you're suffering, then just forget all of that stuff, because it's not right anyway. What is right will be the path of least resistance, where you feel you're naturally being drawn. So if you sit down with the Trojan Deck and you start thinking to yourself, oh, I want to tell a story about love, and then for some reason that isn't working for you, just pay attention to what other themes feel easy. Don't make it hard. Follow the path of least resistance. So that's one of the tips that I've got. The second tip is to think about the story first by trying to work out the emotion you want the story to contain. So when you watch this effect, remember the effect is the impossible coincidence. The premise in Josh's story is a love story. Your premise can be anything you want it to be that makes sense and supports the effect of impossible coincidence. It could be that you were walking down the street and you looked into a shop window and you saw reflected in the glass the face of someone you haven't seen in 20 years. And then you turned around and had a conversation with that person. And it turned out that they weren't even meant to be in that street on that day, right? We're not about love stories anymore. Now we're about reuniting friendships. So, and that's just an easy example there. So follow the path of least resistance. Yeah. Think about themes. And here's the final tip. When it comes down to actually writing, like I'm guessing the majority of people will sit there and type a script on their laptop. Top tip for you, and I swear by this, turn off spell check. Turn off grammar check. Unsubscribe from Grammarly or whatever you're using to edit your writing. And here's why. That romantic imagery of the artist, that romantic imagery of the writer, why is it always a man at a typewriter or a woman at a typewriter? It's because typewriters didn't tell you off for making a mistake. When you're typing on a computer, that red line that underlines that word, all that's doing is pulling you out of creativity, and it's taking you into analysis and editing. Creation and editing. Free yourself by creating as one and then editing as another. So turn off your spell check and free form create by following the path of resistance. A couple of tips that might be useful.
Yeah, one final thought on Luke's final thought. Luke, I was with my little cousins who go to school and are quite little, I think 6 and 8. And I learned that they now in school, when they write, when you're first learning to write, so I think it's earlier than 6 years old, when you first learn to write, no longer are you, because I think I was like looking over the shoulder, I was like, oh, that's very close, but actually the P goes the other way. And my cousin was like, we don't do that anymore. We let them get it down, spell it phonetically. We don't correct it. We embrace it all, because at this point, we're not trying to pull them out of getting it down and being themselves. We just want them to put it there. And so what you're talking presages sort of what all academics are thinking about in learning for young children and fostering creativity. So
They also use what they call the talking tin, and they get the kid to record their voice of what they're saying, and then when they write it back down again.
The thing that just jumped into my mind was that actually what this reveals is that maybe the best way to find your story is to find the way that is easiest for you to tell your story. For some, that might be writing. For others, it might be speaking. Right? It might be easier for you to imagine yourself speaking it than writing it out. But I think the path of least resistance is really the thing that I try and follow now. Because also, you do magic for fun. It shouldn't be hard. You shouldn't be sitting there unhappy because you can't work out your script. This is fun, right? So let it be fun.
And a tip from me, if you are struggling for your own story, is sometimes the truth is so magical. And when we're dealing with coincidence, that's more true than pretty much any other subject. You just need to look at all these amazing true coincidence stories. There are so many of them. So you can use that as a springboard to find your own story. But we don't have to just start with nothing. We can start with true stories and build on that. And that's why I think actually when people first watch this and think, I could never do Josh's story, I actually think it's way easier than they may give themselves credit for. They'll find it easier because there are so many true stories that they can build upon for this.
And you know what? If you've done a magic trick in your life and you have successfully completed a magic trick from start to finish for another human being, and you have successfully fooled that human being, then you've definitely done something that's more difficult than telling a story. Because you told stories from the moment you were born, and you've been told stories from the moment you were born. Whether you've spent 50 years studying magic, you could spend 1,000 years studying magic and you would still be better at telling stories than doing magic. You just don't realize that about yourself yet, because you understand the world through story. You've been taught through story. Every time you watch a movie, you are becoming more educated in story. You're an expert in stories already. So if you've been able to learn how to do a second deal, a bottom palm, a one hand top palm, a retention vanish, none of that was born, right? You had to learn that. The good news is when it comes to story, you didn't have to learn it. You already know it. And now you've just got to do it. Like, it's not hard. You can do it.
Well, look, this was supposed to be a 30-minute thing, and I just wanted it to last way longer because this has been a true masterclass from you both sharing this. Luke, thank you for your time. And Josh, thanks for...
Thanks, Luke.
I'll just repeat, I think it's a spectacularly good trick. I think it's a fantastic trick. And just a couple of things. The method itself, without tipping anything, is utilitarian. So even though I think this Trojan Deck effect that you saw in the performance earlier is fantastic all by itself, as Josh mentioned, it can do a lot of other stuff. And I've used it since Josh shared it with me 10 years ago, or however long ago it was. I've used it in my own tricks, and I really think that the method is worth attention, even if you're just interested in the method, right? Like, all of this pretentious chat about story, you can throw that out the window because the method itself is really good.
Well, thank you. It means a lot to hear that from you. And thanks, Andy, for hosting it. I'm delighted to be in a room with two of my best pals.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. And finally, people have been asking in the chat all throughout, how do you get this? It's going to be on vanishingmagic.com, but you already know that. But once again, Josh, thanks for going through this whole process so that everybody else doesn't have to. That's what's so great about when you release a trick. This is not just some trick you came up with last week. This is a trick you have worked on for, I guess, a decade, and you've thought through all of the details so that we don't have to. So thanks so much for sharing it. Thanks, Luke, for your time. We will see everybody else very soon. Goodbye.